Ukraine continued to win big in the city of Bakhmut, regaining much of its territory. Why did the Russian army suddenly run away? At a press conference at the Kyiv Press Center on Friday afternoon, May 12, Ukraine's Deputy Defense Minister Hanna Maliar said the situation in Bakhmut city is very dynamic, everything moves quickly. The Russian invasion forces continued to focus their main efforts in the Lyman, Bakhmut, Avdiivka and Marinka directions, where 44 attacks were repulsed. The fiercest battles continued in the towns of Bakhmut and Marinka. In the city of Bakhmut, in the past few days, Ukrainian troops have actively attacked Russian forces who are in a state of serious depression, after successive defeats and retreats that turned the Russian position upside down. Confused. Against this backdrop, the Air Force carried out 14 attacks on the human and equipment clusters of the invaders. The rocket and artillery force hit 11 control points, 19 clusters, ammunition depots, fuel depots, 9 artillery positions, an air defense system and 2 other important enemy targets. Some Russian military bloggers who support the Kremlin believe that boss Wagner Yevgeny Prigozhin is responsible for the current situation, for causing confusion in the army when he announced the withdrawal of troops on May 10, in order to force the Russian Ministry of Defense to supply artillery shells to his group. They demanded his arrest and brought him to trial. However, some other Russian military bloggers, also supporting the Kremlin, said that Prigozhin was not responsible at all. Russian regulars should not rely on a group of mercenaries. The second army in the world whose success or failure is determined by a paramilitary group is absurd. According to this second group, the main responsibility for the defeat of the Russian army today is the United Kingdom, because it has supplied the Ukrainian army with depleted uranium ammunition in large quantities. Poor uranium bullets are 70% heavier than lead, creating significantly more kinetic energy. When in contact with the armor of a tank or armored vehicle, the bullet parts will break and sharpen themselves, making their path more dangerous for the crew inside the armored vehicle. Major General John Kirby, communications coordinator for the National Security Council, said that no Russian tank or armored vehicle could withstand the destructive power of this ammunition. He said, if the Russians are very concerned about keeping their tanks functioning properly, then they just need to get them across the border back into Russia and get them out of Ukraine, that they don't belong there in the first place. That would be my recommendation if they are concerned about threats to their tanks. At the press conference, exiled Mayor Ivan Fedorov of the city of Melitopol said a large explosion was heard in Melitopol in the Zaporizhzhia region just 2 hours before the press conference. The city is now under Russian aggression. In the last 24 hours, 750 Russian soldiers have been eliminated from the battle along with 5 tanks, 8 armored vehicles, 15 artillery systems, 2 multiple launch missile systems, 2 air defense systems, and 12 troop transport vehicles. And fuel. Overall, from February 24, 2022 to May 12, 197,670 Russian troops were eliminated from the battle. Total combat losses of the invaders also included 3,745 tanks, 7,295 armored vehicles, 3,068 artillery systems, 559 mass-launched missile systems, 312 air defense combat systems, 308 aircraft, 294 helicopters, 2,636 drones, 970 cruise missiles, 18 warships, 5,996 troop and fuel transport vehicles, and 393 special equipment units. 2. The head of Wagner accused Zelensky of lying, asserting that the Ukrainian counterattack had happened. Founder and financier Wagner Yevgeny Prigozhin dismissed Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky's remarks that Kyiv still needed a little more time before launching a predictable counteroffensive. Zelensky is lying, Prigozhin said on his official social media channels on Thursday. The counterattack is in full swing. In the direction of Artemovsk, which is the Russian name for Bakhmut, Ukrainian armed forces units are advancing on the flanks. And, unfortunately, in some places they have been successful, he added. Prigozhin's comments come after Zelensky said in an interview on Thursday that his country needs a little more time to allow additional Western supplies to arrive before they can launch a counterattack. Founder Wagner continued that Ukrainian forces must first resolve the situation in and around Bakhmut before attempting to advance into other areas. That is why the Ukrainian offensive has begun. Those units that have been trained, received the necessary weapons, equipment, tanks, everything else, they have fully participated, he said, and did not forget to repeat his complaint to the Ministry of National Defense. Russian defense about the lack of ammunition supplies. Wagner continued to carry out combat missions in terrible shortages of ammunition and starvation, because the promises of the Department of Defense were not fulfilled. Ukrainian military officials previously said the counterattacks around Bakhmut that Prigozhin mentioned were only part of a struggle for position and did not necessarily involve a larger counterattack effort. On May 1, Colonel Serhiy Cherevadye, spokesman for the Eastern Ukrainian Military Command, explained that the front lines are constantly changing. Sometimes the enemy achieves some success after an artillery attack. Powerful and destroy the infrastructure, and they can move forward. But we counterattack and often regain our position after firing at the enemy. 3. UK confirmed to donate Storm Shadow cruise missile to Ukraine. The UK has donated Storm Shadow cruise missiles to Ukraine, the UK Ministry of Defence confirmed on Thursday. This follows CNN's exclusive report earlier on Thursday that the UK will supply Ukraine with multiple Storm Shadow cruise missiles, citing conversations with senior Western officials. Ben Wallace told lawmakers on Thursday that the donation of the Storm Shadow missile was additional to the long-range systems that had been previously donated to Ukraine, as well as Ukraine's own Neptune cruise missile. The donation of these weapons systems gives Ukraine the best chance to defend itself against continued Russian atrocities, especially deliberate attacks on Ukraine's civilian infrastructure, which this is contrary to international law, Wallace told Parliament. 4. UK crosses Putin's red line. Newsweek had an article titled UK crosses Putin's red line, which means UK crosses Putin's red line. The United Kingdom said on Thursday it had begun supplying Ukraine with Storm Shadow long-range missiles for use in the fight against Russian President Vladimir Putin's invading forces. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has long asked for long-range missiles to aid the country's defense efforts, although Western allies have been reluctant to grant his wish for fear war could escalate. Latter. The Kremlin has also said that long-range missiles could lead to an escalation of tensions. When discussing the possibility of the United States supplying long-range weapons to Ukraine, Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said last September that such a move would be interpreted as crossing a red line could lead to a broader military response. On Thursday, British Defence Secretary Ben Wallace told lawmakers in the House of Commons that the Storm Shadow missile was currently entering or staying in Ukraine, but he did not say how many missiles Britain planned to send. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov strongly reacted to information about Storm Shadow missiles being supplied to Ukraine. Peskov said that the Kremlin was assessing the arms transfer very negatively, and that the move will force our military to respond accordingly, which, of course, will make appropriate decisions from a military point of view, according to state media agency RIA Novosti. The Storm Shadow missile has a range of more than 250 kilometers, 155 miles. While this range is slightly less than the 185-mile capability of the U.S. Army air-to-air combat missile system that Zelensky requested, it still has enough range for Ukraine to strike behind the front lines in regional targets, such as the Russian-invaded Crimea. Earlier this year, Ukraine's Defense Minister Alexei Reznikov told European Union officials that his country would not use longer-range missiles on targets within Russia. If we can attack at a distance of up to 300 kilometers, the Russian army will be defenseless and will have to lose, he said. Ukraine is ready to give any guarantee that your weapons will not participate in attacks on Russian territory. However, Ukrainian officials do not say that such missiles will not be used in Crimea, as they consider the region to be part of Ukraine, and Zelensky has repeatedly said that regaining control of the peninsula is one of his priorities. In February, U.S. Under-Secretary of State for Political Affairs Victoria Nuland said the U.S. supported Ukraine's attacks on Russian military sites in Crimea, which she called legitimate targets. Will Reno, chair of the Political Science Department at Northwestern University, told Newsweek that he felt the British missiles were intended to put the entire territory of Russia-invaded Ukraine within range of the armed forces. Ukrainian page. That capability would be crucial to support a Ukrainian counterattack on the ground. As for Putin's alleged red line, Reno said that the Kremlin had often shrunk the definition of victory and now encapsulated it in control of Crimea and parts of eastern Ukraine, temporarily occupied since 2014. That change signals weakness to the Ukrainian people, as well as Putin's failure to react decisively when red lines are crossed, he added. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Foreign Ministry by email for comment. 5. Putin willing to use his brutal security services to stop Yevgeny Prigozhin after boss Wagner's insults. London-based Daily Mail journalists Will Stewart and Chris Jewers have a report titled "Putin is prepared to use his brutal security services to put a stop to Yevgeny Prigozhin after the Wagner bosses complete a whole insult," which means Putin willing to use his brutal security services to stop Yevgeny Prigozhin after boss Wagner attacked Putin as totally damn. Vladimir Putin is willing to use his brutal security services to stop his longtime friend Yevgeny Prigozhin, head of Wagner's private army, a new report says. The mercenary force commander called the 70-year-old dictator totally damn and mocked him as a happy godfather amid reports from the front lines of a Russian retreat and while Ukraine is gaining territories around the besieged city of Bakhmut. Prigozhin later hinted that his vulgar verbal attack was in fact directed at Putin's 67-year-old army chief of staff Valery Gerasimov, whom he blamed for a shortage of ammunition in the face. Battle. Another target could be Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, also 67, but many believe it was aimed directly at Putin. The independent news agency Meduza reported that sources from the Kremlin say that Prigozhin has now crossed a red line in repeated attacks on Putin's top officials over their failure to provide ammunition to Putin. His warriors to capture Bakhmut. If this continues, the official security forces will definitely stop it, said Meduza, a source close to the Kremlin. It's not clear if this means Wagner will be liquidated like many of Putin's opponents, or be arrested, possibly for treason, which could expose the 61-year-old billionaire lord up to 21 years in prison. The report said Moscow's propaganda agencies received warnings from the Putin administration that if Prigozhin continued to criticize the Ministry of Defense and reported on failures on the front, journalists had to start describing him as a traitor. After the warlord had threatened to withdraw from Bakhmut if his ammunition needs were not met, media outlets were informed that Putin's administration would turn against Prigozhin if he continued. Breaking ranks. This happened even though Prigozhin is said to still be capable of direct dialogue with the president, according to his mentor. But other sources say that Putin no longer receives calls from Prigozhin. Leader Wagner, whose mercenary force operates not only in Ukraine but also in Africa and Syria, is reportedly protected by people close to Putin, such as General Viktor Zolotov, the force's head. Russia's National Guard, and Tula Governor Alexei Dyumin, the dictator's former bodyguard and thought to be a possible successor to Putin as president. But it's unclear if they can save him now after his latest criticism. Meduza's sources claim Prigozhin's profanities may have been excuses for the defeat at Bakhmut he had promised Putin to take easily. The city of Bakhmut had been Moscow's main target during the winter offensive and was the site of the bloodiest land battle in Europe since the Second World War. Formerly a prisoner for being a gang leader who killed, robbed, and raped in the city of St. Petersburg, Prigozhin became rich by hosting lavish parties in the Kremlin for Putin, hence his nickname the dictator's chef. He also runs a propaganda empire that includes news agencies and military bloggers that post pro-Putin social media messages in Russia and around the globe. And he is behind Wagner and several other private military companies in Russia. But there are concerns that he has become too much of a threat, which the Russian president noted at the prospect of Putin being overthrown by defeat in war or falling to ill health. In a desperate attempt to capture the city, Wagner employed the Sea of Men tactic, killing one unit after another against the Ukrainian defenses. Estimates suggest that as many as 40,000 Wagner warriors were killed. 6. Russian officials say more than 12,000 people have been evacuated from frontline areas in Zaporizhzhia. Russian forces have evacuated more than 12,000 people from frontline areas in the Zaporizhzhia region. Vladimir Rogov, a member of the so-called civil military government set up by Russia, said on Thursday. More than 12,000 residents of the frontline districts have moved to the safe areas of the Zaporizhzhia region, Rogov said on Thursday. More than 4,000 of them left by bus and more than 8,000 by their own vehicle. Rogov urged those still in these areas to take advantage of the opportunity to evacuate under what he called a temporary resettlement program, with residents being given 10,000 rubles or $130 accommodation and meals. Russian authorities began evacuating towns and cities in the temporarily occupied Zaporizhzhia region last week, amid rumors that Ukraine is preparing to launch a long-anticipated counteroffensive to retake it. Territory occupied by the invasion of Moscow. 7. UN, Turkey and Ukraine request extension of key grain deal that expires next week. The United Nations, Turkey and Ukraine have called for an extension of a key grain deal that allows Ukrainian ships carrying agricultural products to leave the country, as the latest talks in Istanbul between the three sides and Russia conclude. Ends on Thursday. Turkey, along with the United Nations, helped broker the Black Sea Grains Initiative in July. The agreement, which is due to expire on May 18, established a procedure to ensure the safety of ships carrying Ukrainian grain, fertilizer and other foodstuffs through the humanitarian corridor in the Black Sea. Moscow prevented the ships from leaving in the early days of the war, exacerbating the global food crisis. Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Vershinin said after Thursday's meeting that meeting Russia's requirements in the deal was unsatisfactory, Russian state media outlet TASS reported. So far, we can say that a lot has been said and promised. We appreciate the efforts of the United Nations and United Nations Secretary-General Antonio Guterres. However, we have not seen any concrete results yet, Vershinin said, according to state media. United Nations Representative Martin Griffiths said on Thursday, the United Nations will continue to work closely with all parties to achieve the continuation and full implementation of the initiative, in pursuit of its shared commitment. Their broader reach to address global food insecurity. Griffiths adds that more than 30 million tons of grain and other food have been exported from Ukraine since the initiative's inception in July 2022. All parties at the meeting agreed to engage with those elements going forward. Turkish Defense Minister Hulusi Akar on Thursday said, "Our wish is to extend the grain deal," according to Turkish state media outlet Anadolu Agency. According to a statement from Ukraine's Vice President Alexander Kubrakov, Kyiv wants the agreement not only to be extended, but also expanded to more areas, adding that future negotiations will take place in the form of online form as proposed by the United Nations and Turkey. 8. Japan pledges $1 billion to help neighboring Ukraine receive refugees. Japan will provide $1 billion to help Ukraine's neighbors take in refugees from the war-torn country, Japan's finance minister announced on Thursday. Besides confirming the results of our financial aid to Ukraine so far, we also want to discuss how to strengthen cooperation with international financial institutions and help Ukraine's neighbors, including the admission of Ukrainian refugees, Japanese Finance Minister Shinichi Suzuki told reporters, according to Japanese public broadcaster NHK. Suzuki was speaking at the meeting of G7 finance ministers and central bank directors in Niigata. "I want to get concrete results and bring them to the summit in Hiroshima," Suzuki said. 9. Why would Ukraine's Storm Shadow missile terrify Russia? Newsweek had an article titled, "Why Ukraine's Storm Shadow missiles will terrify Russia," which means, why Ukraine's Storm Shadow missile will terrorize Russia. The long-range missiles supplied to Ukraine's armed forces will pose tough new challenges to Russia's defenses. On Thursday, Britain's Defense Secretary, Ben Wallace, told UK lawmakers that the Storm Shadow long-range cruise missiles are now entering or are in the country itself. He did not confirm how many total missiles were being sent to Ukraine. Ukraine has repeatedly requested a long-range strike capability, but Kyiv's Western supporters have been reluctant to provide weapons that could be seen as escalating or providing the ability for Ukraine to strike inside Russian territory. However, Ukraine insists it will not use such capabilities to attack targets inside Russia's borders. Ukraine's defense minister, Alexei Reznikov, said earlier in February that, "We will not use weapons provided by foreign partners to fire on Russian territory." Military expert David Hambling said that given the source of information that Ukraine has access to, partly provided by the West, it is very likely that Ukrainian commanders will have excellent information about where their new missiles are located. They attack for maximum effect. He told Newsweek that these missiles have a much better chance of hitting a specific target than basic military drones, and will certainly be reserved for valuable targets very high. According to the manufacturer, the air-launched missiles have a range exceeding 155 miles. They are designed to meet the rigors of pre-planned attacks against fixed or high-value targets, even under extreme conditions. Speaking to the British Parliament, Mr. Wallace said, "Russia must admit that it was its own actions that led to the supply of such systems to Ukraine." UK Prime Minister Rishi Sunak previously said his country would be the first to supply Ukraine with long-range weapons. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said on Thursday that the donation of the Storm Shadow missile will force our military to respond appropriately. The range of the Storm Shadow missile far exceeds that of weapons systems that the United States has given Ukraine, including extended-range versions of the Direct Guidance System, known as JDAM, or missiles provided by Washington called missiles. HIMARS, or High Mobility Artillery Rocket System. However, there is some doubt about the actual range of the Storm Shadow rocket, depending on the model and various reports, said David Jordan, co-director of the Freeman Institute of Aeronautics and Space at King's College London, UK, told Newsweek on Thursday. Earlier this year, the United States said it would send Ukraine small-diameter ground-launched bombs, which the Pentagon's press secretary, Brigadier General Pat Ryder, said in February would give Ukraine capacity longer-range force. These bombs have a range of about 94 miles. The impact of these weapons will ultimately depend on how many Storm Shadow missiles Ukraine receives, Jordan said, but nonetheless they are significantly beneficial to the Ukrainians as it gives them the ability to capabilities, especially in terms of range that they didn't have before. Jordan said the Kyiv army will be able to strike fortified targets, including underground command bunkers, logistics centers, and airfields with high precision. They will also provide the ability to strike the Kerch Bridge, which connects mainland Russia with the annexed Crimea Peninsula. Combined with weapons like JDAM and HIMARS, Storm Shadow means Russia will have to think a lot more deeply about the extent to which the Ukrainians can strike back, Jordan said. Experts say Storm Shadow's range also poses new problems for Russia's air defense organization in the coming weeks and months. Hambling said the missile was impossible to effectively jam and was very unlikely to be intercepted by Russian air defenses. Russia would be forced to move resources, such as ammunition stockpiles, out of range of these new weapons, or watch hundreds of tons of precious shells disappear in a flurry of fireballs. Giant. Jordan said that when Ukraine lacks long-range weapons, Russian forces have the pleasure of knowing when they will be out of range of Ukraine's air-launched weapons. As a result, Russia can reduce its air defenses around other command and logistics bases. The more missiles Ukraine has in the air, the more defense systems Russia has to have and the more defensive missiles it has to stock up to try to take down Ukrainian missiles, Jordan said. Experts say the Moscow military will now have to consider all the targets that the Storm Shadow missile can reach and then how to protect them. This could mean moving air defense systems from the front lines or elsewhere in Russia to cover previously untargeted areas. Jordan said that if these defenses are withdrawn from the front lines, this will give a new advantage to the Ukrainian Air Force. The move raises questions about whether other NATO countries, such as the United States, will provide Ukraine with longer-range weapons such as the ATACMS or the Army Tactical Missile System. So far, Washington has refused to donate these missile systems to Ukraine, which could have a range similar to the Storm Shadows. In March, General Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, told the Defense One website that the U.S. has relatively few ATACMS. We also have to make sure we maintain our own arsenal of weapons, But there is a political element to the move, Hambling said. In contrast to the West's reluctance to provide long-range missiles, the announcement suggests that thoughts have changed, and in fact, the West is willing to provide even more assistance. While a small number of missiles from the UK may not make a big difference militarily, it could signal the arrival of a wider range of heavier weapons, Hambling said. NATO countries. Newsweek has reached out to the Russian Defense Ministry for comment via email.